Hey y'all, it's Kate from the Apothecary and welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to another episode of my favorite 100 books read on Goodreads. This is episode 8 and we only have a couple more episodes left. So I'm just gonna jump right in. The first book up on this set is Becky Lynch, The Man, Not Your Average Girl by Rebecca Quinn. And I absolutely loved this book so much. So Rebecca Quinn is also known as Becky Lynch, the Man in WWE. She is one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. She is my favorite female wrestler. I love watching her in everything. She wrote a memoir based off of her life so far, her life in WWE, outside WWE, everything that's happened so far. And it was so good. She narrated her own audiobook, and so I guess this kind of falls under celebrity memoir. This one was just released this year in 2024. It's a deeply personal memoir from WWE superstar Rebecca Quinn, aka The Man, aka Becky Lynch. Quinn takes us down memory lane starting at age 7 when she first learned of professional wrestling to her meteoric rise to fame in the WWE. We learn about Quinn's beginning years of wrestling outside of the WWE. We see some of her most memorable WWE moments from behind the curtain of Becky Lynch to more personal moments like when she first fell in love with Seth Rollins, her now husband, when she first learned that she was pregnant with her daughter Rue. Different moments like that take us more behind the scenes of WWE. Why is this one on my list? Besides Becky Lynch being my favorite wrestler, and I love her so much, the audiobook was just like a super long promo by her. She read with such enthusiasm and passion and at a really great pace, and I just loved it. I will definitely reread it again, re-listen to it, hoping to get John maybe into it because he got me into WWE and I think he would really enjoy this one. I loved the personal deep dive into Rebecca Quinn's life that we got here. I thought it was just so well done. She wrote this herself and you could definitely tell that this was her writing and not a ghostwriter because it just had her personality to every single word of it. It was easy to follow and understand. It was heartfelt and I just wanted more of it. I wanted more of that personal touch. We got a little bit here and there, but I wanted even more of it. And it just kind of spoke truths that I often think about. Things like women in the professional world and the kind of unspoken expectations that they have for us. And it just hit on so many different levels. Personal level, professional level, wrestling level. I just loved it all. Some quotes from this book. Every journey to change starts with small steps in the right direction. In a world that depends on suspending disbelief, sometimes we suspend our own. And for the girl who was always so average in every aspect of life, average height, average weight, average anxieties, average grades, average upbringing, I have gotten to do some most unaverage things. And I love that quote. And at WrestleMania this year, she had a big match. And that was just when this book was coming out. And she used the book as her WrestleMania entrance. And she had the words all over her gear. And she had her voice narrating the words as they popped up on screen as she was entering for her WrestleMania match. And it was just so magical because I was reading this book at that time and it was the best experience ever. Next up is Small Favor by Jim Butcher. This is book 10 in the Dresden Files and the latest one that I have read so far. There's a lot more to come after this that I haven't gotten to yet, but I am making my way there slowly but surely. This is urban fantasy, paranormal mystery, of course. For me, this is one of those series that you can just substitute any book in the series on this list. I just picked the most recent book that I've read because I feel like each book gets better as they go along. So to me, it made sense to pick the latest one that I've read. But you can really put in any Dresden book here because I love them all and I think they are all great. This one in particular was released in 2008. And in spoiler-free summary of this book, Harry Dresden's life seems to be slowing down until a shadow from his past calls in a small favor that will trap him between a nightmarish foe and an equally deadly ally, and that will strain his skills and loyalties to their very limits. Why is this one on my list? First of all, it's so entertaining and easy to read. It doesn't feel like I've read 10 books already, but this is book 10 in the Dresden Files. Each book reads fast, and each book gets wilder and better, in my opinion. The atmosphere, particularly in this book, was so well done. I felt that swampy feel so much. I felt that setting that didn't want us there. We'll get to that in just a second. And of course, I can't talk about Dresden Files without talking about the audiobook narrator. He does such a fantastic job. I cannot remember his name for the life of me at this moment, but you all know who he is. You've all heard me talk about him before, and other people like Leslie at the Nerdy Narrative. He plays, I think, Spike on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He does such a fantastic job narrating these books. I love it. I can't read Dresden Files without listening to the audiobooks now. So, some quotes from Small Favor. Looking at the place filled me with a sense of awareness of the attention of an empty, sterile malevolence. This place did not like me. It did not want me here. And that was what I was talking about when I was talking about the atmosphere. You just feel that sink into you. Our next book up is a classic. This is Persepolis, The Story of a Childhood by Mary Jane Satrapi. This is translated by Matthias Ripa. This is comics, graphic novel, memoir. I read this first in college. It was first released in 2003. I consider a classic now, even though it is in that comic graphic novel form. It is so well done. Spoiler-free summary for Persepolis. Satrapi tells the story of her life in Tehran from ages 6 to 14 that saw the overthrow of the Shah's regime, the triumph of the Islamic Revolution, and the devastating effects of war within Iraq. The intelligent and outspoken only child of committed Marxists and the great-granddaughter of one of Iran's last emperors, Marjane bears witness to a childhood uniquely entwined with the history of her country. Intensely personal and profoundly political and wholly original, Persepolis is at once a story of growing up and a reminder of the human cost of war and political repression. That is perfect summary of this book, really. Why is this one on my list besides being amazingly revolutionary for its time? It lets us see history through the eyes of a child, which gives a totally different perspective to history, especially history of that time and that place in Iran. Up until this memoir, we didn't get that. We barely got any history of that time in Iran in general. And what we did get was very adult driven, very violent, and focused more from the Western point of view on Iran instead of from the Iranian point of view. And it was just so unique in the way it told it. It was moving. It made me cry every time I read it. And what it means, not only is this told from the child's perspective, but also, we see women in Iran at this time and all that they have to go through that time. They're the property of men. They have to be covered up. A lot of that is still relevant today in Iran, but we see today women starting to fight for their own rights and their own voices, and I feel like this just keeps propelling them towards that progress, and eventually those women will get there. But I am so proud of the women that have fought for their rights so far. And this was released on my birthday, so I feel like I have a special bond with this book. Some quotes from this book. Nothing's worse than saying goodbye. It's a little like dying, and I can relate to that quote so much because I tell people that is the one word that I refuse to say in kind of parting of someone, farewell of someone. To me, goodbye is such a final word that I will say it, when I'm talking about it, but I will not say goodbye to someone until they are in a coffin. And even then, it is extremely hard for me to do. In any case, as long as there is oil in the Middle East, they will never have peace. And that is the sad truth of the Middle East. Oil drives them, and it drives a lot of the world. And because of that, there truly will never be true peace in the Middle East until all of the oil is sucked up. Our next book up is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This is historical fiction, a literary fiction I call it too. It's kind of like that historical fiction, literary fiction borderline. This was released in 2017, and this was such a unique book that I read. A spoiler-free summary of what this book is all about. This takes place in February of 1862. The U.S. Civil War is less than a year old. We're just a year into this Civil War. The fighting has begun in earnest, and the nation has begun to realize that it is in for a long, bloody struggle. President Lincoln's son, Willie, is gravely ill. Days after doctors predict that Willie's recovery, he dies and is buried in a Georgetown cemetery where the majority of our story takes place. Saunders spins an unforgettable story of familiar love and loss that breaks free of its realistic historical framework into a thrilling supernatural realm. How do we live in love when we know that everything we love must end? In this book, we see Lincoln grieve for his son, and we see him struggle with not only his own personal demons and his family's demons, but we see him kind of interact with these ghostial figures, and it is such an interesting way to tell this story. I really want to reread this because the first time I read it, I loved it, and it's made it on this list, but I feel like this is one that I'll get more and more out of the more I read it. Why is this book on my list? Well, I think I've kind of just stated some of those, right? It's wildly unique approach. Like I said, I didn't understand everything on the first read, but it still stayed with me, and I think on more rereads I will understand more and more. It's pushing the boundaries and blurring genre lines in a way that up until I had read this book, I hadn't really seen a lot of before. I had a hard time of kind of explaining what genres this book was, because it kind of blurred a lot of different lines here. Some quotes from this book. In this state, he could be of no help to anyone, and given that his position in the world situated him to be either of great help or great harm, it would not do to stay low if he could help it. And that just gives you that kind of mentality that Lincoln had throughout his presidency. When a child is lost, there is no end to the self-torment a parent may inflict. And last one, from nothingness there arose great love. Now its source nullified, that love, searching and sick, converts to the most abysmal suffering imaginable. And that just sums up the grief of a child so well. Our next book up is House of Salt and Sorrows by Aaron A. Craig. This is book 1 in the Sisters of Salt series. This is a YA fantasy with a little bit of horror thrown in there. It's a retelling of a fairy tale that I had never heard of before, The 12 Dancing Princesses. I had never heard of that before, but this is a retelling of that. This was released in 2019. Our spoiler-free summary for this book says, Annalee lives a sheltered life at Highmore, a manor by the sea, with her sisters, father, and stepmother. She once had 11 sisters. Now there are just 8 left, with each death more tragic than the last. Villagers believe that the family is cursed by the gods. Annalee is determined to uncover the truth while her sisters sneak away at night to dance in luxurious balls. Why is this one on my list? It was magical and enchanting and completely swept me away. Like I said, it is based off of the fairy tale The 12 Dancing Princesses, which I had never heard of, and I love a book that makes me interested in source material that I had never heard of before. The atmosphere in this book is so spooky and so good, you can't help but feel it. And it was one of the first books that made me really interested in atmospheric writing. Some quotes from this book. It shouldn't matter what your parents did, just what you do as a person. Come not as you are, but as you wish to be seen. It smelled like autumn here. Pine needles and cold, crisp air, bonfires and moldering leaves. The world dying as it ready to be reborn. And I could just smell that right there. That description was so well. Maybe because I grew up in the middle of the woods and I know what that smell is like, but I didn't even have to try to smell that. We are born of salts and starlight. Regret was the darkest nightmare of all. Next up is a book that is a little bit contentious for folks. I had to put it on here because it's been one of the most influential series I've read. It came to me at just the right time, which was later in life than a lot of people have discovered it. I first read these books when I was in college, and it kind of found me in one of my darkest periods of my life and kind of brought me out of there. And so I couldn't not put it on here, but I will talk quickly through it. For those that don't want it, I'll raise my hand when I'm done talking about it. That's, of course, the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. The book that I chose from this series is Harry Potter and the Order of Phoenix. This is book 5 in that series. Of course, fantasy YA. This was first released in 2003. Don't really need to give a spoiler-free summary on what this is because everyone kind of knows the story of Harry Potter, and if they don't, then they don't want to at this point. But why did I choose this one out of all of the books in the series? For me, this was the first turn in a darker material in this series. We got some like dark moments throughout this series, but in this book is when like the entire book felt darker. We also had a huge jump in maturity in this book. The first kind of 4 books got a little bit more mature as they went along, but this one felt like it was a big jump in maturity. I loved the inner monologues that we got here that didn't quite work in the movies. Inner monologues are hard to pull off in film, but in books they can work so well if the author knows how to write them. And I felt like it truly captured the life at that age of our characters, that teenage life when they're disgruntled. They are always complaining, they feel awkward, they're just out of place everywhere. It just, to me, it captured that time of life so well. And this is the first time where, at least for me, I started questioning who was good and who was truly evil in this series. And our villain in this series, Professor Umbridge, was just fantastic. She was such a great villain. Just a couple quotes and then we'll move on. Just because you have the emotional range of a teaspoon doesn't mean that we all have. A classic quote from there. Indifference and neglect often do much more damage than outright dislike. In my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes in the entire series, thoughts could leave deeper scars than almost anything. Madame Pomfrey. And that wraps up our Harry Potter talk. So now you can, if you didn't want Harry Potter, you can tune back in. We are moving on to the next book. That is Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald by Anne Teresa Fowler. This is historical fiction based off of course, Zelda Fitzgerald. This was released in 2013. It's a dazzling novel that captures all of the romance, glamour, and tragedy of the first flapper, Zelda Fitzgerald. F. Scott and Zelda met in 1918. Zelda soon falls for him, but her father isn't impressed. Scott isn't wealthy or prominent or even a Southerner, but when he sells his first novel, This Side of Paradise, to Scribner's in 1920, Zelda agrees to marry him, and the rest is history as we know it. Why is this one on my list? Because I have always had a fascination with Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. Both them as individuals and them as a couple has always captured my imagination. So when I saw this, I couldn't resist and I loved every second of it. This is one of those books that have a lot of differing reviews on Goodreads. Some people absolutely hated it. Some people loved it. Some people thought it was just okay. I loved it, obviously, because it's on this list, but just know if you're going to go into this that there's been mixed reviews about it, so take that with a grain of salt. And you can see the research that Teresa Fowler did for this book. She went deep into that research, and I love it when you can see that research, but it doesn't feel like a research paper. Next up, and I think we only have a couple more, is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This is a mystery thriller with LGBTQ rep. This was released in 2021, and this book completely rocked me. Spoiler-free summary: a black father and white father, 2 murdered sons, and a quest for vengeance. Ike and Buddy Lee, 2 ex-cons with nothing else in common other than their criminal past and love for their dead sons, band together, confront their own prejudices about their sons and each other, and work towards their desperate desire for revenge. Why is this one on my list? Razorblade Tears had amazing storytelling throughout the whole book. It's emotional, raw, and real characters that just leave you thinking about them for days. I actually did this via just the audiobook. I started as immersion read, and then I was so caught up in it that I just went straight through the audiobook. Adam Lazar-White is our narrator for this audiobook, and he does such an incredible job of capturing this story and these characters so well. Some quotes from this book: folks like to talk about revenge like it's a righteous thing, but it's just hate in a nicer suit. Tears ran from his eyes and stung his cheeks. Tears for his son. Tears for his wife. Tears for the little girl they had to raise. Tears for who they were and what they all had lost. Each drop felt like it was slicing his face open like a razor blade. And that quote gives me goosebumps every time I read it. Our next book up is another classic. This is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. This is book 1 in the Anne of Green Gables series. Of course, I've only read the first book in this series, but I definitely want to get to the rest of the series eventually. This is, like I said, a classic YA, a little bit historical fiction, I guess. This was first released in 1908, and our spoiler-free summary, if you don't know what Anne of Green Gables is about: Anne Shirley, an 11-year-old orphan, has arrived on Prince Edward Island to learn that the Cuthberts wanted to adopt a boy, not a girl. Anne quickly works hard to win them and their town over. Why is this one on my list? This is such a heartwarming, sweet tale. Anne is just perfect. I loved her so much. And the first time I read this, I thought, why hadn't I read this much earlier in life? If I read this growing up, I would have immediately attached to Anne, and I am still shocked that I hadn't read this before then. The relationships built here are just so genuine, and the atmosphere feels like home, both good and bad of home, but home. Quotes from Anne of Green Gables: my life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes. People laugh at me because I use big words, but if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, haven't you? And last one quote is: Anne always remembered the silvery, peaceful beauty and fragrant calm of that night. It was the last night before sorrow touched her life, and no life is ever quite the same again when once that cold, sanctifying touch had been laid upon it. The last book on this list, I think this is the last one, is another classic and also another Toni Morrison book I couldn't resist because she's just so damn good. This one is The Bluest Eye. This is classic. It's historical fiction-ish. This first released in 1970. Spoiler-free summary of The Bluest Eye. This was Toni Morrison's first novel and one of her most impactful. This is set in Morrison's hometown of Lorain, Ohio. It tells the story of a black 11-year-old Piccola Breedlove. Piccola prays for her eyes to turn blue so that she will be, quote, as beautiful and loved as the blonde, blue-eyed children that she sees. With its vivid evocation and the fear and loneliness at the heart of a child's yearning and the tragedy of its fulfillment. Why is this one on my list? First of all, Toni Morrison's words never fail to touch me, move me, inspire me, and make me feel both sad and full of love. And they never leave me. I felt every single emotion in this book. And You could tell by reading this book that every word was written with love, care, and emotion. Some quotes from this book. I'm going to try to read these without crying, but I can't guarantee because Toni Morrison always makes me cry. Love is never any better than the lover. Wicked people love wickedly. Violent people love violently. Weak people love weakly. There is no gift for the beloved. The lover alone possesses his gift of love. The death of self-esteem can occur quickly, easily in children before their ego has legs, so to speak. Couple the vulnerability of youth with indifferent parents, dismissive adults in a world which in its language, laws, and images reinforces despair, in the journey to destruction is sealed. So that is this episode of my favorite 100 books read. If you've read any of these books, let me know in the comments below. What did you think of them? Which ones are you going to be adding to your TBRs to come? Which ones would make your top 100 list? As always, keep reading, and I love you out to the moon and back. Bye.